made the decision to leave because they were unguarded and unprepared. Well, once Washington was taken, as we mentioned yesterday, the British simply were going to march on to Baltimore, then to Philadelphia, then to New York City, and they weren't trying to capture the colonies or states back. They were simply trying to make sure that the United States of America would never again declare war on their country, and anything they needed to do worldwide, they'd have to almost have Britain's permission to do so. So we talked about the British assault on Baltimore. We said that the people of Baltimore knew that their city would be the next target of assault by the British. The British would plan to take Baltimore, then Philadelphia, then New York City. Civilians back in Baltimore prepared for the invasion. They dug defensive trenches on the town's perimeter. They began to barricade access to all ports around the city, and they stationed about 700 soldiers on the outskirts of town. Well, for the British to be successful in capturing Baltimore, they knew they had to secure that protective garrison or fort in Baltimore Harbor known as Fort McHenry. And the commander of Fort McHenry at the time is Major John Armistead, and he had kind of a plan for the British. Knowing that they were coming, he ordered a new American flag for the garrison in Baltimore Harbor, and he wanted to have that flag sewn as large as humanly possible to fly over Fort McHenry as basically an act of defiance. You know, we're ready for it. Okay? Now, this is when we kind of got into events at Fort McHenry and British retreat. We kind of started with that by telling you that on September 12th of 1814, British ships of war approached the ports of Baltimore with Fort McHenry as their target. Great Britain had sent 5 of their 8 bombing vessels in their arsenal to Baltimore to show their seriousness to take the city. And on one of those bombing ships was an American lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key. He was a lawyer, like I mentioned, who was traveling with the British to try to negotiate the release of one of his clients that was being held on another of those 5 ships heading to Baltimore Harbor. Well, Francis Scott Key convinced the British commander, Robert Ross, to release his client after he showed Ross evidence that would clear him of his crimes, and Ross agreed to release both Key and his client after Baltimore was taken. So once the city would be taken, they would release both men. That's where we ended yesterday, right? Okay, well, British really had twofold strategy at Baltimore. These were the 2 things they were going to do to capture that city. Okay? 2 things that the British were going to do. This is the British strategy at Baltimore, twofold. One by land, one by sea. The first strategy was they were going to make a major British naval assault, which would commence in Boston Harbor with the idea to capture Fort McHenry. So the #1 strategic goal of the twofold strategy was to bombard the ever-living Dickens out of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor and secure that garrison. Once they secured the garrison at Fort McHenry, the second part of their strategy is they would send approximately 4,000 British troops that were stationed north of the city into the city and then capture the city. So they knew they had to have the garrison first, so they were going to attack the garrison by sea through Baltimore Harbor, bomb them into submission was the idea. Once they captured Fort McHenry, then they were going to send the 4,000 British troops that they had stationed just north of Baltimore into the city to clean house. That was the twofold strategy of the British at Baltimore. Now, these British cannonballs from these 5 ships we talked about, they had a range of almost 2 miles. Imagine that. They could shoot almost 2 miles. Obviously, their accuracy isn't going to be great, but they had the range of at least 2 miles. Okay? And you might get lucky. Okay? So the British ships had a range of 2 miles. Now, Fort McHenry had 56 French naval guns mounted at the fort that could shoot into the harbor. Okay, they had 56 French naval guns that could shoot into the harbor. The range of those naval guns from Fort McHenry was about 1.5 miles, 1.5 miles. They could shoot, again, with some limited accuracy. But obviously they'd be more accurate at 1.5 than you would be at 2. Okay? So both the British and the soldiers at Fort McHenry had naval guns, but they had a little bit difference. One would go 2 miles with limited accuracy, the other one would go 1.5 miles with limited accuracy, okay? Well, if you were the British, where would you station yourself away from Fort McHenry? How far would you be away? Well, more than 1.5 miles, right? Because you would not want to get hit. Would that allow you then to fire your shells and still be within range of them? So that's what the British did. Because of the difference in range abilities, the British vessels stationed themselves just short of 2 miles from the fort. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 in the middle, they stationed themselves so they could not be hit by those naval cannons that were stationed at Fort McHenry. So the distance is going to be just out of range from those American cannons that are firing from Fort McHenry. Now, there's ships in kind of in order, like the first one, second one, British ships. First one, second one, third one. Just so happened that Francis Scott Key was on the first ship, which was in the front of the battle. So he basically has a front row seat of this siege of Baltimore and Fort McHenry. So he's on the first ship in order, Francis Scott Key, and he has basically a front row seat of the conflict. So, first day of the conflict, Fort McHenry survives 6 hours of continual bombardment by those British ships. 6 hours, continual, one after another after another. So on the first day of the conflict in Baltimore Harbor, Fort McHenry survives over 6 hours of continual British bombardment. And boy, were they lucky. After that 6 hours of continual bombardment, on September 13th of 1814, on September 13th of 1814, the men at Fort McHenry discovered there was a powder magazine in the fort with hundreds of barrels of black powder. So what would have happened if one of those cannonballs fired from one of those British ships would have hit the powder magazine? I mean, just would have totally destroyed it. So they were very lucky. During that 6 hours of continual bombardment, not one ball hit that powder magazine. Who's the American commander? Armistead. So he's discovered this powder magazine, and as he's looking on, deciding what to do with it, a British cannonball lands in the powder magazine. But it failed to do what? Explode. Those cannonballs had, gunpowder in them, and when they would hit, they would explode. So the damage wasn't the cannonball hitting, it was the cannonball hitting and then the explosion. Well, as he's watching this unprotected powder magazine with hundreds of barrels of black powder in the middle of Fort McHenry, all of a sudden one of these British cannonballs lands right in the magazine, but fails to explode. Well, Armistead immediately has his men move all the barrels of black powder to a safe area that was under the fort's rear walls. Okay, so he moved them to a secure area where he didn't believe a cannonball could get to. So as soon as he watches this cannonball land in the powder magazine, and he's lucky enough that it doesn't explode, he has his men immediately move all those barrels, hundreds of barrels of black powder, to a safe area under the fort's rear walls. In other words, the fort's walls that are farthest from the cannon fire. Well, after you bombed for 6 hours and you didn't have much luck, what might you do if you were the British commander? Go ahead. You get closer. And that's what he decided. So a British admiral ordered the ships to move closer to Fort McHenry. And the reason for the move closer to the American fort was that most of the British cannonballs were inaccurate at 2 miles. They were kind of close, but they weren't doing a lot of damage. So the British ships are going to move closer to Fort McHenry. Well, when they move closer to Fort McHenry, they get into what? Range of our cannons. Okay? And what happens is, because those British ships are now in range of the cannon fire from Fort McHenry, many of those 5 vessels are hit. And some are destroyed, including the Devastation and the Volcano. Those were the names of 2 British ships that were destroyed by American cannon fire once they moved closer to the fort. So again, in the meantime, during the time they're moving these powder kegs, a British admiral orders the ships to move closer to Fort McHenry, and the reason for the move closer to the fort was that most of the British cannonballs were inaccurate. They weren't causing really any damage at the 2-mile radius. Now, because the British ships are in range of cannon fire from Fort McHenry, many of the vessels are hit and 2 are destroyed, including the Devastation and the Volcano. So, what are they going to do now if you're British? You're going to do what? You're going to retreat back beyond that 2-mile barrier, around that 2-mile barrier, so you're out of range again. Well, I want you to think about this. So picture this in your mind. They move closer. The soldiers and commander at Fort McHenry start firing their cannons. They start hitting ships. They destroy the Devastation of the Volcano. The British admiral orders his ships back beyond the 1.5 mile radius. Well, then they decide to start to double fire at Fort McHenry. In other words, instead of 1 at a time, boom, 2 at a time, 2 at a time. Maybe we'll get lucky and they'll start doing some damage. So once the British are forced to move back to the 2-mile barrier, they begin to double fire at Fort McHenry in retaliation to the shells they took when they were within range. They start shooting double fire. I mean, it's just quite a sight. Now listen to this. As a result of the double firing by the British at Fort McHenry, the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air light up the city of Baltimore that evening. That's what people are seeing as they're sitting in Baltimore that evening. They're seeing the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air. They're seeing this double firing by the British at Fort McHenry. Who's a witness to all this? Who has a front row seat? Francis Scott Key. Now, as Key watches this evening, he fully expects to wake up the next morning to see a British flag flying atop the flagpole at Fort McHenry. I mean, they are launching shells like crazy in there. I mean, you're seeing the rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in air. And he's fully prepared that when he wakes up the next morning, if he goes to sleep, that he'll see a British flag over Fort McHenry. That's what it looks like from his vantage point. That bombing, double bombing, goes on for 25 hours. 25 hours of the rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in air. And when Francis Scott Key takes a look at Fort McHenry after that 25 hours of bombardment, what does he see? He still sees what? The American flag flying over Fort McHenry. They have held out on that 25 hours of siege without surrender. Well, after 25 hours, after 6 hours of initial bombing and 25 hours of more bombing, double fire, the British become convinced during that last 25 hours Fort McHenry is not going to be breached, so they retreat. Okay? They retreat. The city of Baltimore has been saved. Well, Francis Scott Key is still on board of one of those retreating British warships. And as he's on board, as it's retreating, he writes down everything in his mind that he witnessed during that 25-hour ordeal. He just keeps those thoughts in his mind. So as that lead ship is retreating back away from Baltimore Harbor, Francis Scott Key is writing down everything in his mind that he had witnessed during this ordeal, especially the last 25 hours. Well, once they get retreated to a safe distance, they free Francis Scott Key and his client. and Key goes to a hotel to rest in Baltimore. So retires to a hotel room in Baltimore after this is over. And what does he do in his hotel room in Baltimore? He puts all those thoughts that he has in his mind and he writes them down into order, makes them into some sort of semblance of order. So as he writes everything down in his mind as the British ship is retreating, once he gets off that ship and retires to a hotel room in Baltimore, he begins to put his thoughts into writing. And the result of his thoughts and remembrances of that night turn into be the American Star-Spangled Banner. Now, you know, we watch this on TV and we stand up kind of half-heartedly at ball games and because we kind of have to. And you even have to start reminding people to take off their hats. You ever notice when I announce, I'll say, would you please stand and remove your headgear? Because if I don't say that, there'll actually be people that stand there with their headgear on. I was listening to the pro football game last night between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Green Bay Packers, and when that guy said, please stand and rise for the singing of the national anthem, he told everybody to take their hats off. Okay? But do we really know it? I mean, we know it. I mean, every one of you could sing the national anthem, I'm sure. Everybody could probably sing, okay? But let's see now that we've heard the story, if we really understand it. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed as the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. What's a rampart? It's a rocket, right? Is that right? Or what is a rampart? What? It is. It's a rampart, it's a defense area on the fort. Very good. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. That's what this is all about. This is why you stand up for the Star-Spangled Banner, is because of what Francis Scott Key witnessed during that 25-hour siege at Fort McHenry. That's where it comes from. Now, I'm going to show you a video in a minute, but that original flag is in the Smithsonian, and it's in the National History Museum, and sometimes it's on display, and sometimes it's not on display, depending on what they're doing with that particular flag. Maybe when we get there someday, we'll have an opportunity to see. What I'm going to do now is I want you to watch this video. I want you to add anything that maybe I didn't mention, and I'm going to show you the siege of Baltimore and Fort McHenry live, so to speak, as best we can. Okay? Now again, I like to show you these because I think they're really important. So let's be paying attention and let's be writing some things down that maybe I didn't say. Maybe some new info. It's a great story, I think. And I don't think enough kids in history classes or kids in schools in general across the country really know as much as they should about the origin of the Star-Spangled Banner. I really don't. But you will get it today because we tend to try to teach you as much as we can.
August 1814. Ominous shadows on the Atlantic horizon. British ships of war. The enemy marches toward an unguarded capital.
It was astonishing how little had been done to defend Washington.
Panicked residents evacuate. The last defenses fail.
6 miles northeast of Washington. They rolled over the Americans in 1 hour.
The Redcoats pour into Washington, D.C. and set a fire of revenge. The destructive power of an attack on American soil resonates with another, later disaster.
There's a great similarity between the destruction of the public buildings in Washington and 9/11. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was the same kind of fear.
The unfinished Capitol and Treasury building both go up. The 3,000 books in the Library of Congress fuel its destruction. Not even the White House is safe. The bricks and mortar of American democracy are reduced to smoking rubble. The war begins 2 years earlier. Triumphant America has already won its independence, but Britain continues to treat it as a colony.
The British were in the midst of this titanic war with France, and they didn't care about trampling on American sovereignty to further their war ends.
Among those trampled are more than 7,000 American sailors kidnapped at sea, forced recruits in the British war with Napoleon.
Britain's first line of defense was its very strong Royal Navy, and they needed a huge amount of talented sailors to man those ships of war.
England is more than threatening American independence and American standing. They're disrespecting it and they're dismissive of it and essentially saying you have no standing.
Proud spirit of liberty and independence. It has not proceeded.
And in the 18th of June, 1812, a bitterly divided Congress, as bitter as it was during the Vietnam War, declared war on Britain.
I declare war.
When you say the War of 1812 to most Americans, they have no